What we're going to do is we're going to kick off by just introducing the folks up here. For those who have not done your homework and are lazy and have not read their bios. So I'm just going to go from right to left.
Stage right.
Yes. We're going to start with the Ben, then go to Amanda, and then Laura to introduce themselves, and I'll introduce myself last. Best for last. It's okay. We're going to have fun, guys. It's okay to smile and laugh. There you go. Thank you. Gosh, so many white and Asian people in one room, and they're not happy. Jesus. There we go. Now we're on fire. Go ahead.
Thanks so much. If you were to take a bucket and stick in AI and then ethics and then education/learning and stir it all together, that's what I do every day at Microsoft. And so I train our engineers, I train our employees on the subject of responsible AI or responsible design, responsibility in general. And we're all figuring that out as we go. And I view myself as a learner and not just a teacher. And so I think being here, I represent myself, not necessarily a company, and here to listen to you as well as just share my personal story. And really it's all about personal transformation and change in response to the responsibilities we have with technology. Ben Olsen is my name.
Amanda.
Yeah.
Hello. My name is Amanda Casari. I am, contrary to popular belief, according to your programs, I'm actually an engineering manager at Google Cloud, and I work on a team called the Developer Relations Team. For those of you not familiar with that term, the Developer Relations Team is the team of engineers, people, program managers, product managers, all kinds of people who come together and try to help the engineers and people at Google understand the needs of the community, the voice in the community, to build things that help our developers use our tools better, and also to connect equally across the world so that we are not designing for single groups or communities, but designing for all. Di is actually a design advocate as a part of the developer relations team, who's a fabulous human being, so thank you earlier for talking, Di. And I am here, it's interesting, former did work in data science and ethics and privacy. The team I'm working with now actually deals with infinite compute at scale. So I do a lot of work now, not necessarily in how should our company have ethical behavior, but actually designing these systems and people and engineering teams and feature decisions that are enabling us to use things responsibly and to have equitable representation in the room. Because I'm a hiring manager and I get to do that. And I strongly believe that if you have power and access and privilege, it's your responsibility to give that away.
Thanks. Yay. I'm Laura Norén. I work at a cybersecurity company called Obsidian Security that's actually in Southern California. So I'm visiting the nice weather today. Previous to this job, I've been here for about a year. I was at NYU Center for Data Science, and I am sort of the advocate for all things data ethics, which means I'm sometimes advocating for our own employees against the third-party vendors that we're deciding to sign up for. We're young, so we're still making those decisions. And sometimes I'm advocating for our customers' employees, because we look at a lot of their data. I work in cybersecurity. That's the way you're supposed to do it now. That works the best. But as you may or may not know, as employees, you don't have tons of rights. There's not a lot of power on the employee side. So I try to make that my job.
And I'm Timothy Bardlavens. I'm the black guy, literally. No, seriously. Okay, anyway, I always introduce myself as the black guy. It's a part of my shtick. If you ever see me speak before, I always do it. I'm just saying. So what do? I do a lot of things. I am now product design leader at Zillow, where I lead a team that basically does Zillow offers, which is our company changing the industry to say, hey, we now are a corporation that buys and sells homes, and you can finance through us. Amazing. So we make it easier too. It's a headache right now. It's only like a year old, so there's a lot going on. Outside of that, I am a cultural strategist, a diversity, equity, inclusion consultant, and because I spoke in Vancouver once, I'm also an international speaker.
Word.
Only takes one time to have that moniker. All right, so we're going to jump in here. It's interesting because these three individuals all of your work kind of is based in the same thing. We've actually have heard this work spoken a lot throughout the time that I have been here, which is data, whether it's the collection of it, the leveraging of it, or the dissemination of it. And so I kind of just want to talk about just in generally, like what is a very general question, what is the impact of data? Whether it's on humans, whether it's on systems, like what is that impact? It's very general. I want to see how your brains work.
Since I was given the mic. So for me, my background is actually in robotics and electrical engineering. So when I think of data, I actually think of data as points in time that are representative of a signal we're trying to collect. So for me, the questions that I ask around data isn't even what can I do with it? It's where did this data come from? What does it mean? It is a point in time, but it is not, and is a representation of something that happened, but it is not the thing that happened, right? It's an observation. The people who design those sensors are the ones who are choosing what they're trying to measure. The ones who build the systems that create the sensors and then put it all into a database, they're making very distinct decisions along the way. They may not realize they're making those decisions and the downstream effect of those. So how do we better collectively educate them, help them understand the decisions they are making, the social constructs that they're representing when they're creating a database or making a decision to smush together some categorical variables, which are ways that we talk about like things that are not numbers. So when you add all those things together and collectively that defines a picture or a narrative, and when we do things like we're like, oh, we're going to open source it all, none of that narrative, none of those decision makings along the way are easy for you to see or to understand. So when I think about data, for me, it's if we're really serious about creating things and making them open for people, how do we design that traceability and that decision making and allow people to correct for that along the way, and also make sure that people who are doing all of that work is not one portion of society or the world, but actually is spread across for different societies, because I don't think all of the solutions are going to come from us. I think it's going to come from people who are building and a part of those systems now.
No, that's okay. I used to teach a class about quantification. And so when I think about data, I think about the very earliest attempts to try to quantify people, which is probably kind of what we're still doing. We quantify other things too, not just people, but mostly this is a power project, as are so many things that have to do with social life. So they who have the data have the power. And now there's tons of data out there, so this isn't just, one eye of Sauron kind of thing, although sometimes it sort of feels like that. So that's really, we're here investigating power. And that has been brought up in the other talks, and I was very glad to see that. And that's whenever anyone says privacy, I think what you really mean is power.
What I'd add to both of those excellent answers is that data is yours. And I think that's the shift that we're seeing in the industry right now, that I'm seeing inside of Microsoft's special projects, secret things I can tell you a little bit about today. Just that I think there's a shift to the idea that the information that you provide isn't automatically just a neutral thing or a thing that the world can take from you, and that it's about a just exchange of value. And what does that actually mean in practice? Well, we're trying to figure that out, and I think that data is yours will be shifted more towards in AI systems towards processing happening on your phones, and then abstracted things being sent back to companies just for the purpose of feedback, right? So they can improve their systems, not so that they can collect all your personal data and then use it for their own nefarious research purposes or whatever, right? I think that's the shift that I want to bring to light here, is that it's yours. And the more that we can think about it like that, the more cognizant we'll be with the technology we use, and the more cognizant we'll be in the technologies we build.
So I want to start this question with Laura, because I want to jump off what you said about power. So when because there's actually a bit of a dichotomy between what you said, Ben, and what I think we've talked about, Laura, which is we talk about power and data. We say we want to believe that it's ours, but in actuality, it seems as though it's not. Like we don't know what our rights are as the beholders or the givers of data. And so what are those rights and how are they different as being a consumer, a citizen, or an employee?
Yeah, okay, so just to do a little bit of stage setting, so I think philosophically a lot, so I'll let you into my perspective and then you can probably rapidly dispose of it. But when I think about, like, what is it that's so interesting and challenging about where we are now when it comes to data? Like, why is this new? We started status projects in gathering quantified data about people, hundreds of years ago, so why now are we so intensely focused on this as a problem? And it's because we've never really been able to have the complete portrait of what someone is and what they're doing that we can now. Like, that's never happened before. Even in our own heads, like, I couldn't know my genetic code, and I still can't. I can't, but it can be known. And so that's one thing. And then this data portrait that we're able to gather from people and put together, especially if you're combining data from different places, can persist past the end of the life of a person. And that kind of ethic, like, that blows our minds in terms of, like, well, how do you do consent if you're dead? Does that even apply to you? It probably should, especially if you're thinking about genetics, like, your genetic information has some implication for your kid's genetic information. So yeah, there should probably be something that, and these are the real reasons that we're asking about that. So why do I get into questions about power? And what does that mean for, like, well, are our data ours? Well, I don't know. I would say that's still kind of an open question. I can't actually, I'm not a geneticist, so I can't really know that much about my own genetic code. I feel protective of it. But it really challenged, like, the distancing from that which I think of as me. I think of my genetic information as very closely related to me. I think of those things that I type into Google as very revealing of some inner part of me. But I don't have a lot of control over those things. And that's where I think we need to work in that space. Does that mean we should always be terrified of Google? Probably not. Google does a lot of good things for me. I'm not going to stop using Google. I know, and she works there.
And please talk about it. Like, that's
Well,
what
let's, yeah, like,
we are here for that. Yes.
this is an open
Yes.
space, right? She seems pretty
Yes.
cool. And she'll
She'll
totally smack me down.
all
She also seems
Google.
pretty strong, so.
Tweet all of this out. It's totally fine.
So yeah, I mean, like, the question about power isn't always like, should I wrest it back for myself? Is that the best answer to this? Probably not. I'd like to share some of my data with Google because they do things in a powerful way that I actually like. I'm okay with some of that relationship. Are there other parts where I wish I had more transparency? Sure, but let's have that conversation. So that's kind of how I think about this. I set it out there as, like, there's just more about me or any given individual that is knowable than has ever been before, and it will persist for longer than we've been able to think about sort of the ethical ramifications of that. And it spreads across groups. It's not just genetics that gives a lot of information about what groups do. If you're working in data science right now, you kind of know that, like, studying groups is the new hotness in terms of really having deep insights into what people are going to do. So it's a long way of not answering your question and just using a lot of words. But that's okay, because Amanda's going to answer it.
No, but I think you bring up some fascinating points about like, why is this so such a hot topic now? And I think that part of it points to the idea of privacy and power goes around to opt in, opt out around your data, who you're giving it to, who is making inferences about data that you did not give them access to. And it really goes back to me around, if we want to go back, again, like, we're going back to where some of these issues you can relate to that are not digital. The information that is collected about people and how that can be weaponized against them. And thinking about, like the 1960s, right, and how there were files being collected, that our government was collecting on individual Americans about their actions in case it needed to be used against them. So when we think about how data and inferences and things, it's not just that it's happening, it's that it's happening at a scale that we can't still comprehend, because when we try to talk about global scale, like, that is so hard to fit in your head. Right? The ideal that everything is scale-free is not true. And so these actions are happening at a scale that we can't quite wrap our arms around, and also are potentially being weaponized against us and weaponized against us disparately. And we see that happening. And so when I think someone earlier, and I'm sorry, I remember your name, was talking about, I think it was Shankar, was talking about that we already have broken brick and mortar systems that we're trying to automate and turn into technology systems without acknowledging that they're broken now. And instead trying to automate things that are already broken. And I think that is also where a problem is coming from, is because we are ignoring the brokenness that's happening.
So there are so many things in that I want to point out. So I heard, like we hear disparate impact of data. That's one big thing, right? There's also again, power as it relates to data. Let's look at on the other lens of who has the power to gather and interpret it, and how does that disproportionately impact people, especially people who are underrepresented and underfunded. Just would love to know like your thoughts on like how does that happen, and then really the question is how do we prevent that? Like how do we prevent bias in data or the disproportionate impact of data on individuals?
I'll go for sure. It's a lot packed in there. So I think the thing, number one is, I think we've heard this today already, like you can mitigate bias, you can never really eradicate bias, and really when it comes to having underrepresented groups be served by the product or service you're building or the platform you're building, the step one really is to engage deeply with yourself, with the systematic inequalities at hand in society. And for me, something that really hit home when I was doing this about a year ago, before I invented the job that I have now, was that I was seeking out people to change my views on things like, or to enhance my views on these inequalities. So for one, I was trying to find out in education, because I'm an educator, I'm a learner and educator. I sought out a lady, Trish Mullines-DeZico from Technology Access Foundation in Seattle, and she founded a bunch of schools for Black children in Seattle to really be educated and be seen and by Black teachers and by teachers of color, and trying to just understand, like, number one, like, do I have any like implicit or unexamined biases to how can I make sure that these people show up in the systems and technologies that I have access to, so that they can then have access. And I think that you know, that's just one example, like personal example that I want to bring of like just be super active about what you, like how you engage with the concept of bias, because it's so pervasive. But when we talk about the systems themselves, like, yeah, you want to include have a diverse data set. But diverse data sets are really hard to collect. You want to have diverse models, or like you want to mitigate bias in models, but it's hard to see inside the models themselves. So you have to develop intelligible model practices, and it's just like you pull at one string, you're going to have to pull at the whole thing. I think that you have to really look at bias and fairness in the entirety of the life cycle of an AI ML system to even think about how you might begin to mitigate it, and then like what rubric are you using? I think this goes back to some of the earlier things you've heard today. So, yeah.
Yes, and I think if we want to build more inclusive, more diverse, more fair AI and ML systems, we can do all the algorithm and data mitigation we want in the world, but until we hire and promote underrepresented people into these groups who are making these decisions, and not just hire them, promote them, make it a situation where they can be promoted and can lead, because the only way to do systemic change is to intentionally change the system. And the system's not just going to change itself, that we don't have enough incentives for that. So we have to intentionally change the system at scale. And by doing that, when you are a manager in these situations, we tell people, bring your authentic self to work. We create diverse and inclusive environments. We have policies around this. And then when the challenges approach us around what that really means, we say, can you go talk to HR? Because this is just too challenging for me. And that's bullshit. And I was told we were allowed to curse. That is bullshit. When you are a manager, when you are a leader in tech, when you are given that power, you have to figure this shit out. And it's hard, and you're going to make mistakes, and I make mistakes all the time, but I learn from them, and then I have people tell me how I make mistakes. And the only way that you continue to go about doing that is by building those systems so those people are in the room to ask those questions before it gets released as a product, to ask the question of, is this a good idea? Let me tell you about my experience. Let me tell you about my experience when I didn't go to the same school as you, and I grew up in a different way, and how these things might be used against you. Let me tell you about my experience when I was in an abusive partnership, and this person wanted to take control and access over my information. And when you're thinking about designing this system so there's only one person in the household who has access, you might be allowing them to weaponize that against me. So I think having people with those experiences in the room that is present, and you build that trust culture, that psychologically safe culture that we like to talk about, it means that you have to build those with the management, that people are in the room, and you have to be that manager who can show up and do that.
Sometimes there are problems you just really can't solve by automating them. Like criminal justice in this country, I mean, the input data is fucked. So just that's not the right solution, is to then automate anything there.
So, I got chills, y'all. Ooh. Also, the AC just may have kicked on, too.
Take it wherever you get it, man.
So, Laura, I'm curious from your perspective, because a lot of your role currently is the advocacy for the company's employees and how they use data, as well as really your employees and whatnot. So, I'm just curious, from your perspective, when we talk about a lot of this, and again, that ownership, that power of, how do you help, I guess, bring that representation in the room to ensure that, or even really, how do you begin to understand who are these people and their experiences, and how are we impacting them potentially by holding on to this data or not holding on to this data? How could it affect them positively or negatively? How do you work through those things?
Okay, so let's just do a little bit of employee data 101. So probably all of you have had a job at some point. You probably have had more than one. So your data is in some third-party system, probably for payroll, QuickBooks, or Gusto, or whatever you guys are using. That's really, really accurate data about you, because you managed to get paid, I'm guessing, that the check arrived, or the direct deposit. So that's pretty accurate, your social security number, all that stuff. That's really, we can quibble about how we do identity these days, but social security number, birth date, your name, the places you have lived, that's pretty much constitutes the hardcore what we think of when we think of identity and data. And that's in all HR systems. So this is really high target, high value stuff, because it's very accurate, and it pretty much describes all of your identity. And I work in cybersecurity, so I'm of course afraid about what bad guys are going to do, and street crime in cybersecurity is to redirect your paycheck to their direct deposit number and that kind of thing. So these are very highly targeted areas, and it's really rich data. And so I advocate. I assume that nobody wants how do I know what employees want? Well, I don't, and actually that it does kind of keep me up at night. I'm advocating for people, but I can't talk to all the people, and how do I know what they want? I'm pretty sure that they don't want their paycheck to be directed to someone else's account. So there are a few things I feel I'm reasonably accurate in my assumptions, and then there are a bunch of stuff that I just don't know. So I talk to our employees. That's where I start, because they are people that I can talk to. So my first job is to advocate for them. So I look at things like data retention. I look at things like, what if you work for me, and then for whatever reason you don't work for me anymore? Can you go to that third-party vendor and say, hey, look, I don't work here anymore. Can you please delete my data record so that I don't have that exposure? Nobody ever asks those questions, so I go and ask that on behalf of our employees, and then I give them a little data audit, which of course they're bored by, but they're happy that someone's doing it. So it starts like that, and then and so I do work in cybersecurity, and we do think that the best way to actually protect people, and a lot of times, our customers are all corporations, right? They're not employees. We don't do a customer or a consumer product. We just only work with companies. In order to do that well, we do have a lot of, we'll know, so for instance, if you're using Office 365 or G Suite, we would know when you change permissions on a file or have an attachment or something like that. Maybe that doesn't seem too revealing. It really does help us to understand when someone might be trying to get a phishing attack going or something like that. But what you write in those file names that are attached, we know those, and I'm concerned about that. I'm sure your bosses like you, and your coworkers do like you to have accurate file names. So those are pretty revealing. So we work on how can we protect some of that information, so that if you send around Amanda's termination letter .pdf, dated XYZ. Dated, yeah, tomorrow. that not everyone who's monitoring that product, which is probably that company's IT department. So maybe someone who actually knows Amanda would see that. Like, how do we deal with those kinds of questions? So those are do I know what everyone wants? No, I don't, and it does make me nervous. But can I assume that probably Amanda and whoever else is facing some sort of corporate action doesn't really want the whole IT staff to know that? Yeah. We're not so far we don't worry terribly much about breaching data because, we're cybersecurity, so the one thing we do really well is cybersecurity protocol. But we will be, and we're small, so we're not a huge target yet, but we will be someday, and I assume that you don't want your data breached. But there are no real legal protections for employees, so like with respect to what their employer can do in cybersecurity. So I try to advocate for employees because in that context, you guys have almost no power whatsoever. Sorry.
Scary. I've had like 7 jobs in 3 months, so now I'm really concerned. I'm joking.
We can
Dang,
talk
y'all are
afterwards.
so stiff. My God.
Well, someone out there is like, oh, I want to hire him.
Right. It's called
7 jobs,
experience.
3 months.
George just said, a lived experience is better than learned experience. Now listen, it's a great quote. I texted that to one of my friends. Ben, and we can actually come around, but I'm going to start with you. So I asked you previously this, like the difference between ethics and thoughtfulness, and then really is like, how does thoughtfulness and ethics, like how do those things lead to action? Especially because like something you said, and I think in general, it's this thing of, hey, if like you had the privilege to be able to go and talk to a person and to get information from them, but you have like engineers who half the time they just want to build really cool stuff. They don't give a damn about who's on the other side. It's like, did I build this? Did the like pull request come through? Did someone approve it? I shipped it. Great. Am I going to get my paycheck? Right. So how do we bring thoughtfulness into that very transactional type of role where you're not hired to think of humans, you're hired to push code?
Great question. So to date, I've been kind of answering things more on a more personal level, but I'll go back to like the industry lens because I think that's an industry question. It's like how do we change behavior? How do we get people to pause and reflect and be thoughtful in their engineering processes? It's a work in progress. And you can't do it in a tops-down way. I think that the reality when you're in these Fortune 500 companies is that you can't just come in there and say like, let's be ethical. Most of them probably think they are being responsible to some degree. So it's number one, insulting. I think number two, it's not meeting them where they're at in terms of everybody, every learner, every person is an individual. And engineers and designers alike, it's not like they're just a different class of persons altogether. And so I think you're dealing with this really complex dynamic of they have their personal values, they have their ethical systems. Then you're in the context of this company, and then you're in the context of the world, which also has its own norms. And so when I think about this problem, I think, okay, yeah, it's super complex, but I think it's about raising the bar. So when you're in industry, it's about raising the bar, and it's about really defining the practices in a crisp sort of way of saying, here's how we do it, here's how we put in periods of reflection or engage with stakeholders from diverse populations, or here's how we actually build models that are transparent, and here's how we're accountable for the products or services we build. And that kind of conversation takes time, but and it also takes a really embedded honesty and I think it comes back to access too. It's like really there aren't that many people who have access to these populations of people who are building code to change practices. So it behooves them who are, and I assume some of you in this room are building or coding or designing. It's really up to you to be an agent of change as much as you can. And of course, yeah, there's Ethical OS toolkit, there's stuff you've seen today, but it requires an unprecedented amount of personal engagement and involvement and an ability to think systematically and think really at an individual level and traverse that with skill and pizzazz and excitement and almost like a tireless courage because Another thing, I mentioned Trish earlier. Another thing she taught me is, if you see something, say something. Like step one of being woke, and I'm not saying I am, is like step one of being woke is to, if you see something, say something. And that's to me, like if you see a colleague doing something you don't think is right, and that's on every spectrum of ethics, whatever you're talking about, say something. And if you see something in your system that doesn't look right, say something. I think that's what we're seeing in tech today. That's like the Google protest, our own internal protest inside Microsoft on how women are treated. I think that the reality is we're trying to look at this with like a clear and open set of eyes and say, what is happening? Let's see something, say something. Let's build a future that we want, and do that together, and not exclude, not cause harm, not do these things that to date we've just done because we've been moving so fast. So I think thoughtfulness to me is like inserting periods of slowing down, being crisp, defining our terms, defining our practices, driving coalition around what matters, and doing that in a way with some serious world-class skill. And that's what's required in Fortune 500 companies. Yeah.
So I lied because I want to actually jump to Amanda real quick. Something that you said. So Amanda, you talked about the power of saying no, and I want you to speak on that a bit, especially on the theme of see something, say something, but also I want to ask you as a leader of a development team, how is it that one, who has the power to say no? Or who has the privilege to say no, and then two, how can you at least help someone learn to say no or learn to raise that red flag, especially if they have biases in which they don't know that this is a problem? Because I think that's something is that you have a very homogenous industry who they have their own lived experiences, but many of them may still be very different from the folks in which they may be affected. So how do you help them see a bias if they don't know it's a bias?
Thank you for asking that question. So I think this stems from the conversation we had around being able to say no is a privilege, right? You don't always get to say no. You don't know if you're going to have another opportunity. You don't know if you're going to be able, if you can ruin a relationship. You don't know if the power dynamic is in a way where you are going to be able to recover from that. You may not have mobility. You may be the sole provider for somebody who has a terminal illness, and you cannot leave the job that you're in, regardless of how you feel about how things are going. It's really important for managers and people of power to recognize that these things all exist and they may be invisible. We may not know about that, and part of that is around building trust. You may not have trust with your employees, and that might be you, and it might be them. It might be things out of your control. It might be things within your control. But if you don't recognize that not everybody can say no, then you will make an assumption that at any point, strong opinions loosely held are things that everybody can do and are perfectly fine. I think there was a great article that came out in the last 2 weeks about how this is actually toxic for us as an industry, and this is why this is toxic for us in industries, because the people who do this are ones who have the privilege of saying no and who have the privilege of having their minds be changed or of being able to have an argument in a group. And for me, when I think about this, I think about how can I enable people that I mentor, people that I work with, engineers on my team, to know that they have the opportunity not only to disagree, but they have the opportunity, we will help them find something else, right? Should they decide that this is not a point in their career, in their time, in their life, that this is work they want to do or that they don't agree with, how can they bring that up into me? How can they bring that up as part of a group? How can I enable them to bring that up to people who have more power than us at the table? How can I support them when they're making those decisions in ways, and also let them know if I can identify risks in that process as well, right? As to, hey, there are some systems and things in place that you should know about, that when we bring this up, this is the resistance we might get. This is the impact this might have. How can we go about thinking about either mitigating that or helping, how can I support you with that? How can we make those changes that can happen? If there are systems in place for performance, then we should think about adding things like thoughtfulness as a performance indicator. Reward it, right? Promote based off of that. You don't have to work with assholes. Like that, if you are a manager and you are a leader, if people on your team are assholes, you should be doing something about that. There's a lot of avenues that can help you with that. So don't promote people who only want to push code. Don't promote people who only want to build these things and just do their job. Help them understand how that's not helping them. It's not helping the team. It's not helping their users. There's training for that. Some of it works and some of it doesn't, right? And some of it's building teams where they feel like they can work and trust with each other on that. If they ask you for opportunities to expand their worldview, if they ask you for opportunities for education, to connect with other people, things that are not necessarily within the norm of how we go about doing our work on a daily basis and will challenge you to do more work as a manager, fucking support that. I'm sorry, I'm cursing a lot, but like support that, right? So support the people who know their biases, who know their boundaries. When they start having those realizations and they're like, actually, I'd like to stretch myself a little bit in this way, and I still, like, it might be a risk for my career and I'm concerned about that, ask the question of how can I help you? How can I support you to grow in this way? Because I care about that, and I care about your career, and I care about you as a person. So you have to be invested. Like that's the part for me. And if you don't have the energy for that, I want to say that's also okay. Like not everybody has that energy all the time. You need to have trust with your team as well to be able to tell them, like, being a human and a manager at the same time is really hard. And if I want you to be vulnerable with me, I got to be vulnerable with you. And honestly, I struggle with that the most. And the reason I struggle with that is because I don't want my engineers to lose trust with me, that I can represent them, that I can be there for them, that I can help them with their work in a system where managers are pretty powerful. So I don't have the solution for all that. That's work I'm doing. But I got to say out there, just like as a part of this, is you're going to have people who are going to have ideas like they want to give a presentation at a very high profile conference to demonstrate, maybe all of the tools that your toolkits are using. And they want to give a challenging presentation that shows that women scientists on Wikipedia are being misrepresented and they're being shut down by the systems in place. And they would like to highlight that with their talk and the technology at a very high profile conference. Support them to do that work and to use their platform and to use their voice, even when it's something that like may not be the typical story that you see. I can go on about this. I'm turning this over now.
Did you have something you want to say? No? Okay.
No, I mean, I could speak more from a startup perspective,
Go
where
ahead.
like we don't have. Amanda's referring to systems. We don't have systems.
Yes,
But that's normal in startups. We don't have systems. But the beauty of that is we get to build the systems that we want to have. So we don't have to say, hey, can we please go back and review these performance review criteria, and can we add one for thoughtfulness, and then what would that look like? And let's ask 20 different groups of other people what they would, because we don't have 20 groups. We have like 43 people. So so we get to build the systems we want. And one of the things that I like to do is I will take, and this takes guts, this takes the kind of vulnerability she's talking about. I'll take policies that I think are going to be controversial among our employees, and I say, well, let's go ahead and circulate that with everyone. Let's get some feedback on that. I know you're not going to like this because I don't know what the feedback is going to be. Kind of pretty much guarantee it's not all going to be positive. And then let's decide where we can flex and where we can't flex. And again, it's not all going to be positive. We're going to have to draw some lines in the sand, and not everyone's going to be happy. So for instance, right now we're looking at our policy to be very transparent with our employees about what we know about what they're doing on their computers. How many of you know how much your employers know about what you're doing on your computers? Interesting. That's kind of what I thought. So we're trying to be very transparent. Like, we're going to know all of these types of data. This is what we know. This is what we do. This is what we don't do. If we thought there was something wrong, here's all the levels of escalation we could go to. And we're going to circulate that before we firmly decide what it is that we do. So there's stuff like that. At a startup, you can do things differently. It's a little scarier because you're responsible for making the right decision at a very deep level. We do that. Sometimes we go to legal and say, hey, look, we haven't done this. This doesn't seem super critical to our particular culture. Tell us what the standard is. And then sometimes we say, no, this is very critical to our culture. We're going to build this ourselves, and then we'll go work with legal to make sure that we're not violating any laws. But there's different ways you can do that at startups that looks a little different than when you're in a big company.
What's interesting is when I worked at Microsoft, every week there was a report that came out because we all self-hosted or dog food or whatever you want to call it. And so there was a report that came out that showed the list of names of people who hadn't downloaded or upgraded their system to that next level. And so like it was the most random thing where like there was a clear report that came out that showed like even though you don't think of how much they track, they can literally tell if you downloaded and used this newest version of I was on Edge at the time, so for the browser, if you were downloading and using the newest version of the browser, and you could also tell if the person was using Chrome more than Edge. So they know things, y'all. So we have like 15 or so minutes left, but I want to ask one last question because the interesting thing about this is it's something I'm super passionate about, which of course is organizational culture. And so there's this internal, external thing where internally we have to develop, implement certain systems in which will directly impact humans externally. And so like how the systems are set up now, they're okay, but they go against so many underrepresented people. I think, especially in tech, the biggest people affected by technology are people living with disabilities. And so, like, how is it that you take something where you have, especially people living with disabilities, I think are considered the world's largest minority. Interesting fact, if you didn't know, they are. Like, how do we better create equitable systems internally, which will thus reflect into how we build, create, monetize externally? It's a very big question. Good luck.
I will rant.
Well, so I think it requires investment. Like it requires freedom to explore new solutions that haven't been done before. I think designing from the edge and working your way in is still fairly recent. So I think there's tons of examples inside of Microsoft of us trying to explore this from every different technology stack. So making sure, for example, that if you're using like your Windows Hello, like you're signing into your system, that like we have every sort of person that you could imagine in a database to try to and anonymize and abstract it and all that stuff to try to make sure that the system is fair and inclusive of all different shapes and people and what have you. So I think that's like maybe one example of how we're trying to design for creating fair systems. And fair systems are super related to inclusive systems. So I think that like when I think of fairness and inclusion, I usually couple them because I think who are we excluding is directly related to who are we giving power to and who are we giving access to. And so I think you have to make it a priority, and that's totally what has happened at Microsoft. Inclusion's pasted on lots of windows with examples, and I think of Emma with, I think she had cerebral palsy, and she's used as an example of like we created a pen that like counteracted the shakes as she's drawing, right? Like and makes it so that her handwriting is smooth. It's just like stuff like this. Like you can't invent it unless you try to get out of your bubble and your mindset, your fixed mindset. And so I think that's really Timothy, to your point about like organizational cultural change. We really have to take it upon ourselves to seek those different perspectives and invest in that as a company, invest in that personally, and just do better. And I think that's what we're trying to do at Microsoft for sure. And it depending on how close you are to customers or not, I think. And I heard a comment earlier today about I'm just this person or that person, and I don't have a lot of impact on the overall system. It's like you can never really measure your impact on a system personally. You have to have a faith and fundamental courage to believe that your action, where you're situated now, your specific gifts, your personal passions, all combine into like the position you're in and the levers you can pull to change the system that you're in from the inside. And I think that's what I believe is the exciting thing about being here with you all today. And that's what I'd say is with inclusion, think about that for yourself. Think about what levers you can pull. Think about the experiments you can try. Expand your mind.
Thanks. Yeah, and I would add to that. be truthful with yourself about where you are and who you work with, and identify your gaps. Find the communities and the people who are in those gaps. Talk to them about what they need, and then pay them for it. So that you're not just trying to utilize all of this labor in these communities who you want to profit off of, but actually pay them for their expertise. Go to them and ask them the problems that you should be solving, or that you can solve with them, not for them.
I'm going to just say something that we do, like, if you're just getting started on some of the questions of, well, how do I make this product more usable for a wider group of people? There are some known problems out there that have some decent solutions, like, what color gradient should I use on this? Well, go to universal design principles, and there will be color gradients that work for people who have various kinds of color blindness and people who don't. So there are some kind of on-ramps into doing this stuff right that don't require intense amounts of user discussions, because people have done those and they have shared what they know. So that's the good news, is we've learned a few things and we've shared, so yay. Sometimes we get it right.
I'll say that. And make those a requirement for delivery, right? Don't just have it be the thing that you throw down in the bottom of the backlog, but actually make those a requirement for the thing that you actually want to push out the door, so that it's not the afterthought. It is part of like that part in general.
And I think that's the exciting part, is we're playing with, at these large scale systems, with incentivization about how to align that behavior. And I'll stop talking in a second, but basically we're experimenting with, like, really saying, like, in your commitments at Microsoft, how do you think about all the stuff that we've talked about today, and how are you implementing it in your systems, in your daily work? And I think that like, how do you combine ethics and thoughtfulness in practice? Like, you do it, like you do it. You do it and you learn from it. You have that tight feedback loop. Was that the right thing? And if it wasn't, like, have the humility to say it wasn't, and then come back and get up again and try.
I'll just say, on the last part, I sent Kathleen Hogan a nice email about the whole add inclusive behaviors onto your Connect. It wasn't a nice one, though, because it's how they execute it, but we can talk about that later. There was some bullshit in that. So, questions, friends? This guy with...
Speaking of Microsoft, I'm wondering, Ben, why several times you took great pains to say, I'm speaking of myself, not of Microsoft?
You got to do that. Legal.
Well, so I think one is, like, in my role as a learning leader at Microsoft, I think of learners as going back to my point about individuals, right? Like, I see each one of you as individuals. I'm speaking to this room. I'm speaking to the context that we're in. I think that the problem with data work, with AI work, is we don't think enough about context. We don't think enough about our circumstances and situation. And the reality is, I am one person. I am myself. I'm Ben Olsen. I'm not whether Microsoft hires me or fires me. I'm not whether Google hires me or fires me. And that's how I like to present myself, is I'm speaking to you from my lived experience of being an ethics advocate inside Microsoft, and the personal transformation that I'm working on every day to make sure that I am doing my best work to raise the bar inside of a company that matters a lot to a lot of people, that's shaping some of what we experience today. So that's my answer.
Question over here.
Thanks so much for the mic. My name is Vahid Razavi. I just started a new organization called Ethics in Tech, flew up from San Francisco. Great to see everyone. My question is, when is it a time that you can remember that ethics got in the way of doing business with a company or an entity? And maybe you can share that with us as an example of what made you make that decision to walk away from business.
I will kick this off with the reason I also am with Ben on this is my opinion and not Google's, for reasons that, and this actually goes back to, I heard Timothy say this, legal, because I have not, like, when you work with very large companies, there's all kinds of things that get put in place. Like, I am not a trained spokesperson who's been through PR. And the only way I get to talk about this is when I say this is from me. And so I get a choice. Do I get to try to become that person who's speaking on behalf of Google? Or do I decide to come from the voice of me, who is adjacent and associated with, and is based on my experience there. So I've only actually been at Google since September. So for me, the first time I think that I personally, but not collectively as a business, didn't quite realize the decision that I was making, but I was doing because I felt like it was right, was my third week there was the walkout. So I went from the first week, so I joined, I had orientation. My second week was going to Grace Hopper and speaking on 2 panels, which is a hell of a way to start at a company. The third week was like this big team summit. The fourth week was showing up at my local office for the first time and getting an invitation asking me, would you like to participate in this big walkout that's happening, and here's what it's based off of. And having to make a decision, not quite realizing the company, the culture, the situation, the people, everything, my position at the company, and just making a decision of, am I going to participate in this or not? I gave zero thought into whether or not I thought this was a good idea, and I went, oh, hell yeah, I'm doing this, because this is what is important and right. I have not faced repercussions from it, but I'm seeing the results of decisions like this collectively, of talking with those communities, which for me then is a continued piece of, what are the decisions I'm making? When I'm thinking about this, what is the difference between individual and collective action? The responsibility and the support that I draw as a representative of management, working with and supporting my team. These are all questions that I ask and work with, and I'm try to be as transparent as possible. And also, for me, the risk of, I walk into a room of previously all men, now we have another woman manager, and get to, like, my immediate response to almost every decision is, let's talk about the systemic bias that you just like brought to the table when you're going through this. That's and I can give you a good story around that separately. But part of that is the, like, what is the responsibility that I have as a part of a system? How do I do systemic change? How do I support people who are helping create systemic change within organizations, and those organizations and the people within who are not like me?
Time for one other question or so? You were timid. I'll do you and you. We'll go a couple of minutes over time. It's fine. It's my time now. We on CP time. That's color people time. We're just fighting to give you a
Okay. Hi, my name is Rebecca Yang. Thank you so much. This is everything. So I was formerly a U.S. diplomat serving in Istanbul for 2 years, and currently work at Facebook on trust and safety. And so what I'm trying to do at Facebook, and why I was attracted to working there, is I'm trying to bring more of a global perspective and build a more inclusive culture, so that decision-making and our processes at the company incorporate not just a US-centric, Western-centric view, especially when what we do is global and affects 2.7 billion people. So tactically what that looks like is I'm trying to do more work on allyship and drive that in the company. And something I've observed, and I think we all know, anyone who's been in the DEI space, is that this work is often on the people who are most impacted and care the most, that they just disproportionately carry the burden of this work. I'm fucking tired of that, which is why I care about this allyship work and bringing other people on board. And so my question is, how do we get other people on board? So not the people in this room who are coming in on a Saturday and paid for this and spending all day here with each other, but how do we get the people who, the code and go home people, to start to care or to try to help us with this. This, as you mentioned, Timothy, this work is usually not paid. It's volunteer. It's not even considered core work. It's side projects. And, how do you do this work when you have relatively little power compared to, others at your company? You don't have the decision to make this a priority. You're not a hiring manager. Like, how do you do allyship work when you don't have as much power as others? Yeah.
So I know, I'm not sure if the moderator is supposed to answer these questions, but I'm gonna take on that one. So a couple things. Here's the interesting thing, and really the thing that it sort of stresses me out about this work in general, because there's this thing that happens where, and we as people do it, it's when people of color take on this work, it's like, why are we taking on the emotional baggage of things that other people should just kind of know or work through? On the flip side, if we see a white woman or a white man on the stage talking about diversity work, then all of a sudden it's like, well, they couldn't find a person of color to do that. Like, why is this person doing it? And so, like, there's this weird dichotomy in the industry that happens of, why do we have to do it, but why are they doing it instead of us? And so I think in general, it's something that we just need to throw away, because it's just like, I'm not sure what it is, but we just need to figure out how to throw that whole mentality away. That said, when it comes to being a sole person, not having the power, whatever, when I was started at Microsoft, I was a designer too, and I started an organizational culture initiative that spanned our 250-something person team. And I had to do that myself because that was something I believed in, I really cared about. When I interviewed for the company, I said, I'm the black guy. That was the first slide on my interview. On every interview I've ever had over the past 5 years, first slide is always, I'm the black guy. Because I want to know that, is this company going to be right for me? Because if they don't like that I did that, then I already know automatically, great, wasn't meant for me anyway. So, I don't think where you are matters as much as how do you go about doing the work. And so, yeah, you may have to take on the baggage of having to go and run and create these allies, but if you find enough powerful people in the right places, you'll actually get a lot farther than you think. Other thing I realized, especially as a person of color, is most leaders are okay with having me do the work because they're scared they're going to fuck up. And so it's like, okay, you're scared, so I'll help you. But the problem with the work sometimes comes in is that we as the people who say we should create change, we're telling them we should create change, but we're not actually creating the strategies around it. And sometimes we do have to take on that work of okay, I'm going to be strategic. I have to say, these are the things we need to do for change to happen. And this is just going to, it sucks, but we have to do it. As far as how do you create allies, how do you get these other people to want to do it and do more of it? Honestly, humans suck, and they don't. Some of them just will never care. So really, if you try to boil the ocean, you'll always fail. But if you look for the right level of people in the right spaces, that's going to be your most saving grace. That's where you actually do the best work. And so what I found is middle management is that layer that fucking sucks the most, and they're the ones we have to figure out. Because what you'll find is you'll have senior leadership is yeah, this is great, let's do it. And you have ICs that say, yeah, that's great, let's do it. And you have middle managers say, what the fuck, go do your work. Yeah. And so it's that's the thing that I honestly, as an organization across the board, that's the problem. That's the thing that we need to figure out how to fix. And I think every company has to do it, because working at Microsoft Satya is great about inclusion and diversity and stuff. Every time I hear Satya talk, I'm like, man, you're really smart and I love it. But then I go back to my desk and I have my manager who's the fucking douchebag. I'm like, you know what am I doing here? And so that's the thing of, I guess if it's an answer, non-answer, but allyship isn't probably as important as trying to get the manager or the middle management layer figured out. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing where we should focus the most effort, because those are individuals who are either promoting up people that are just like them, which means they're creating more bias continuously, or they're being promoted themselves, or they just don't care and they're impacting people under them, but people feel oh, this is my manager, so I can't go beyond them, so I'm stuck where I am. So that layer is the most impactful, and it's the one we have to figure out the most. I don't know if I answered all of your questions or some of it, but I just did a lot.
One thing to that. Yes, thank you. I'll add that even the most supportive people who I've met in the middle management layer walked to a room full of people like this who were all talking about how we were all talking around performance and promotion, and they were talking about how their thoughts on the system. At which point I finally raised my hand. And I was like, "You are all the system. This is you. So you are the machine. I know that tears your little punk heart apart, but you need to realize you are the system. And so if you want change, then you got to do that. That is the work you have to do. It's not on other people. So either do that work or shut up about it."
And I'll say one last thing. So when I started at Zillow, second day, I sent a message to all the design leaders, including my VP. I said, our team is hella white and Asian. We need to diversify. Because it was. It literally looked like Seattle. And so since that time, and at the point, I was the only black person on the team and the only person of color in a senior manager role. And so since then, I started in February, we've literally hired a black person a month. So, and it's not intentionally because they were black, but because we started being really intentional about how we hired and brought people in, because everyone believed in it, but no one actually knew what to do. And it basically took me saying, like, we need to fix this, and then me advocating for taking degree requirements off of our job descriptions, because most of our job descriptions had the degree requirement of like HCI, and that's like a very Seattle thing of human-centered. Like my degree is in graphic design. Okay, I'm from the East Coast where I do marketing and branding is where I started out. I should have never been in tech at all. And so, like, them taking that off means that we actually are opening the door for more people. For the research team, the same thing. We took the degree requirement off because learned experience is better, lived experience is better than learned experience. And so by us taking those steps, now we have almost 5 black women on our team in leadership or in senior or mid-level positions. One is an actual manager. And I'm sorry, black women are the hardest demographic to hire, especially in tech. And for us to have 5 of them on our team who are in research and design is super powerful. But it took someone saying, look, we need to fucking do this, and then us doing it. And we're over time. I feel like Obama just now. I just wanted to drop the mic.
All right, awesome. Giving it up. Another round of applause is a good way to end the day. What we have, and obviously, if they're still around, this is where stick around for cocktail hour and ask them additional questions and connect. As we see from the questions that are being asked, we have talent all around here. People from all different walks of life, different perspectives, interesting backgrounds. That's what we want to do. What we're doing right now, the panel upstairs just ended. They're going to be coming down, and we have Cheryl from Artifact who's going to be leading us in a strategy session. So we're probably just going to be starting that in, I'd say, about